The kitchen smelled like burnt sugar and bruised pride, and Nora Chen had learned to tell the difference between the two before she was 25. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of gray Vancouver morning where the rain hadn't decided yet whether it was serious about falling, and the prep shift at Maison Aldrich had barely started when she heard him. Not his words first, his temperature. Marcus Aldrich, the executive chef and co-owner of the most talked-about fine dining room in the city, ran at a specific heat that Nora had catalogued over 3 years of working beside him. There was his Tuesday heat, which was low and manageable, his Friday heat, which spiked before service and cooled after, and then there was whatever this was, the kind that preceded something breaking. The new sous chef, a man who had arrived from Toronto 6 weeks ago with impressive references, and a habit of adjusting things Nora had already adjusted, was standing at the pass with his back too straight and his voice too smooth. His name was Patrick Lorne, and he had a talent for looking helpful while making things worse. Marcus came through the swing door from the walk-in holding a container of duck stock and the expression of a man who had been looking forward to being angry for some time. The shipment from the farm supplier was wrong again. 3rd week. He set the container down on the stainless steel counter with a sound that was controlled and final, the way a door closes when someone has practiced not slamming it. "Nora, did you confirm the order Tuesday last week?" She had. She had confirmed it and followed up and sent a second message when the response was slow, and she had a paper trail that began on a Wednesday and ended on a Friday with the supplier's written confirmation. She said none of this yet. She reached into the pocket of her chef's coat, pulled out her phone and opened the message thread. "Yes," she said. "Confirmed the 14th, confirmed again the 16th. She held out the phone. Marcus looked at the screen. He looked at Patrick. Patrick had the particular expression of someone who had assumed the trail didn't exist and was recalibrating. "Find me a solution for Saturday," Marcus said to Nora. "Not a workaround, a solution." "On it," she said. And she walked out to make the call she had already mentally begun composing while he was still speaking. That was how it usually went. Nora had not spent 3 years at Maison Aldrich accumulating seniority by accident. She had done it by being the person in the kitchen who solved the problem before anyone had finished explaining what the problem was done. She knew the supplier network across the Lower Mainland better than most people knew their own postal codes. She knew which farms ran dry in which weeks of November, which distributors could pivot overnight, and which ones would promise anything on the phone and deliver something different. She was 31 years old, and she had the institutional memory of someone who had been paying attention since the first day she arrived and had never stopped. Which was exactly why, she had learned, certain people in the kitchen did not particularly like her. The conversation she overheard happened on a Thursday evening at 7:15, in the narrow service corridor between the dry storage and the back staircase, while Nora was returning a clipboard to its hook and the two voices around the corner had not heard her approach. Patrick's voice first, lower than usual, which was how she knew it was not meant for general distribution. "Word came through today. The ownership group wants someone in for an operational review before year-end. Some kind of efficiency assessment." And then a second voice, James, the floor manager. Older, careful. The kind of careful that comes from having survived several regime changes in the same building. "What does that mean for the kitchen?" "It means," Patrick said, with the tone of someone enjoying the shape of a secret, "that whoever is running point on the review is going to spend a week here watching the team. And someone upstairs thinks Nora is going to be a problem." A beat of silence. "She's the most competent person in that kitchen," James said. "Not unkindly, just factually, that's not what I mean." Patrick's voice had that particular texture of a man who has rehearsed this next part. "She's been here 3 years and she hasn't been promoted. There's a reason for that, James. She's difficult. She makes the ownership group nervous." Nora stood still in the corridor with the clipboard in her hand and the sound of the ventilation system doing its level best to fill the silence she was not filling with movement. "How much is the bet?" James asked. The question had the careful neutrality of someone who already knew the answer but wanted it said plainly. $50, Patrick said. "Cullen thinks she'll try to perform for the reviewer and it'll backfire. I think she won't even last the week once they start asking questions about the supply chain." "The supply chain," James repeated. "The ordering system," Patrick said. "Some of the documentation from last quarter has gaps." Another silence. "The documentation from last quarter was fine," James said. "I've seen it." Patrick did not answer. The silence stretched in a way that answered for him. Nora walked back to the kitchen the long way, through the dining room, which was being reset for Friday service. The candles were unlit. The white tablecloths were bright under the overhead work lights in a way they never were during service. Two servers she'd worked alongside for 2 years were arranging glassware with quiet concentration, and neither of them looked up, and Nora was grateful for that because she needed 30 seconds of being invisible. She took 30 seconds, then she went back to work. The operational reviewer arrived on a Monday morning that had finally decided about the rain and committed fully to it. He came through the front entrance of Maison Aldrich at 9:45, in a coat that was wet at the shoulders and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested he had not expected Vancouver to mean this particular kind of wet. His name, according to the message the ownership group had sent to Marcus, was Elliot Shu, Director of Operations for the Aldrich Restaurant Group's Western portfolio. Nora had looked him up Sunday night, not extensively. Just enough to know that he had been with the group for 4 years, that he had restructured 2 restaurant operations in Calgary and 1 in Victoria, and that the Victoria restructure had resulted in 3 people losing positions they had held for a long time. She filed this information the way she filed most things, clearly, without drama, and in a place she could retrieve it quickly. She was at the pass when he came through to the kitchen with Marcus and Patrick. Marcus made introductions. Patrick stepped forward in the way people step forward when they want to be the first thing a new person sees. Elliot Shu looked around the kitchen with the methodical sweep of someone taking inventory without appearing to take inventory. His eyes stopped on Nora for 2 seconds longer than they stopped on anything else. Then Marcus was talking again, and the tour continued, and Nora turned back to her mise en place. The first time they spoke directly was in the dry storage room at 2 in the afternoon. When Nora came in to check the inventory sheet and found Elliot Shu standing in front of the shelving with a pen in hand and a look of mild frustration. "The labeling system," he said without turning around. "Is there a logic to it?" "Yes," Nora said. She crossed the room and pointed to the top shelf. "Date of arrival, left to right. Category runs vertically. Anything that expires within the week gets a red tag on the front edge." She pointed to 3 items. "Those 3 need to move by Thursday." He wrote something in his portfolio. "How long have you been running this system?" "About 2 years. The previous one was harder to cross-reference with the supplier logs, so I redesigned it." He looked up from the portfolio. "On your own initiative?" "It needed doing." He looked back at the shelving for a moment. Then he said, without particular inflection, "Did anyone ask you to?" "No." He wrote something else. "Thank you," he said, and he went back to his notes, and Nora recognized the dismissal for what it was, which was not unfriendly, and left. She told no one about this conversation except Renata, the pastry chef, who was the person Nora trusted in the building the way you trust someone when you have spent 3 years watching how they behave when things go wrong and have never once been disappointed. Renata was 44 and had worked in kitchens since she was 19 and had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised her and almost nothing scared her. "He's here to cut someone," Renata said, piping cream onto a test plate with the focus of a person doing 2 things at once. "The question is whether they've already decided who." "They might have." Renata looked up. "What do you know?" Nora told her about the corridor, about the $50 and the supply chain, about Patrick's voice with that particular texture. Renata set down the piping bag. She picked it back up, finished the plate. Then she said quietly, "Has he done anything to the documentation?" "I don't know yet. Find out." Nora had already been thinking about this. The Q3 supplier logs lived in the kitchen management system, and she had access because she had built half of the data structure herself during a period when the previous sous chef had been on leave, and no one else had the patience for it. She went in that night after the dinner service, when the kitchen was being cleaned and the noise covered everything. She pulled the October logs. She pulled September. She pulled the comparative view that showed who had accessed each record and when. Patrick Lauren had opened 17 individual supplier entries in the past 3 weeks. He had not changed the information in any of them. He had added notes. Small notes in the annotation field, the kind of field that most people never look at because the interface buried it under 2 clicks. The notes were brief, almost telegraphic, in a language that was technically neutral but directionally damning. Variance from standard, unclear authorization trail, inconsistency in delivery confirmation. The entries they were attached to were all entries Nora had written. She sat with the screen for a long time. The cleaning crew moved around her. Someone was running the floor mats through the washing station. The sound of water against tile came in waves. She was not going to disappear. She had understood that much in the corridor, and it had not changed. But she was going to need to be very precise about what happened next, and very precise about the order in which things happened. because precision was, in the end, the only advantage that reliably survived. The second conversation with Elliot Shue happened on Wednesday, in the small office off the kitchen that Marcus used for scheduling and that Elliot had been borrowing for his review sessions. Nora had asked for 15 minutes. He had given her 20. She brought her phone and a printed copy of the supplier log from the past 90 days, which she had printed at the copy shop, 2 blocks from her apartment that morning, because she did not want to use the Maison Aldrich printer and leave a record that she had printed it there. This was the kind of thinking that people who had never been in a situation like this sometimes called paranoid. Nora called it preparation. She placed the printed log on the desk. She did not sit down. "I want to show you something before you reach a conclusion from the annotation notes in the system," she said. He looked at the log. He looked at her. He gestured to the chair she sat. "This is the 90-day supplier record." She pointed to the first column. "Delivery confirmation, my initials. Date stamped in the system." She moved her finger. "Cross-reference with the written confirmation emails which I've flagged here and here." She had used small paper tabs, the kind from a stationery store, not post-it notes, because post-it notes fall off. Every variance noted in the annotation field corresponds to a supplier delay that's also in the incoming goods log. The documentation trail is complete. Elliot Shue looked at the pages for a long time. He turned one, then another. "The annotations describe it differently," he said. "The annotations were added after the fact," Nora said. She kept her voice at the same temperature throughout. "I have the Access timestamp comparison here." She produced her phone and showed him the system view she had screenshotted. The original entries were created in real time. The annotations were added in the past 3 weeks, all from the same user login. He was quiet for a moment. "Who has access to that login?" Nora said the name. Elliot set his pen down. He looked at the log. He looked at Nora. He said, "Why are you bringing this to me instead of to Marcus?" "Because Marcus brought you in," Nora said. "And if there's something wrong with the documentation, the review should reflect what actually happened, not what someone else decided to write about it after the fact." She paused. "I'm not asking you to conclude anything. I'm asking you to look at the timestamps before you form a conclusion from the notes." He looked at her for several seconds. The kind of look that is not unfriendly but is also not finished yet. "Leave these with me," he said. She left copies. She kept originals. On Thursday morning, Patrick Lorne came into the kitchen 20 minutes late, which he never did. He went directly to the office. The door stayed closed for 40 minutes. When he came out, his face had the specific quality of someone who has been informed of something and is attempting to process it without allowing the processing to show. Nora was at the pass. She did not watch him. She knew because Renata at her station 10 feet away gave a single small nod that communicated everything without a word. The dinner service on Thursday was full. Every table, the bar seats, the chef's counter. Nora ran the kitchen with the same efficiency she brought to every service. The kind of efficiency that is not performance but habit. The kind built over years of doing the same things right until right became automatic. She called the passes. She tasted. She adjusted. She solved 3 problems in the span of 40 minutes without any of the problems becoming visible to the dining room. Elliot Shue was in the kitchen for 2 hours of the service. He stood against the back wall with his portfolio, writing things she couldn't see. He was not in the way, and he did not try to be in the way, which she noted. After service at 11:15, when the team was breaking down their stations, she was at the sink rinsing a probe thermometer when he came to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside. "You ran that service," he said without looking at her. "I run most services," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been asking." She turned off the tap. She turned to look at him properly. "There's going to be a meeting tomorrow with Marcus and the ownership group," he said. "I'll need you there." "What time?" 10. She nodded. She turned back to the sink. He said quietly enough that it didn't carry, "You should have been promoted a year ago." She didn't answer right away. She picked up the thermometer, dried it, set it in its sleeve. She said with the same evenness she brought to everything, "I know." He nodded once and went back to the office. Renata appeared at her elbow approximately 11 seconds later. "Was that what I think it was?" "Probably," Nora said. Renata looked at the ceiling with an expression of tremendous satisfaction. "I knew since the dry storage." The meeting on Friday morning was at 10 in the private dining room on the 2nd floor, which Maison Aldrich used for events and which had a long oak table and a view of the street that was gray and wet and characteristically Vancouver. Marcus was there when Nora arrived. 2 people from the ownership group, whose names she knew from emails but had not met in person, and Elliot Shue at the end of the table with his portfolio open. Patrick Lorne was not there. She registered this. She sat. Elliot presented the review findings in the organized way of someone who has done this before and has calibrated the pace so that the people listening can follow without losing the thread. He went through the kitchen operations, the supplier relationships, the documentation system, the service metrics. He used words like efficient and consistent and well-maintained in a tone that was not particularly warm but was precise, which Nora had already understood was his version of warmth. Then he reached the section on documentation integrity. He described what he had found, plainly. He described the annotation pattern, the access timestamps, the comparison between the original entries and the added notes. He named the login, he presented the screenshots. He did not use words like sabotage or deliberate. He used words like inconsistency between entry date and annotation date and access pattern suggesting retroactive modification. One of the ownership group members, a woman in her 50s with the kind of directness that suggested she had not reached her position by allowing ambiguity to stand in her way, put her pen down midway through and said, "This is the sous chef who came in from Toronto?" "Yes," Elliot said. She looked at Marcus. Marcus said, "I trusted the hire." His voice was flat in the way of someone genuinely angry and genuinely embarrassed in equal measure. "That won't happen the same way again." "No," the woman said, "it won't." She looked at Nora. The review identified a documentation gap from October. She put a light emphasis on the word identified. "Is there anything you want to add about what happened in October?" Nora said. "The October gap was a supplier error on the 14th. I confirmed the replacement order the same day. The written confirmation is in the email record and was filed in the system on the 15th. She said it without notes because she had known this would be asked and had known she would not need notes. The annotation in the system describes it as an unauthorized variance. The original entry describes it correctly." The woman looked at Elliot. He nodded. A silence that had a particular quality to it, the quality of 43 people not breathing in the boardrooms and ballrooms of films Nora had seen, compressed into 4 people in a private dining room in Vancouver at 10:15 on a Friday morning. Marcus said, "Nora, I owe you an apology for not seeing this faster." She accepted it with a nod. Not because she didn't feel it, but because the room was not the place to say what she felt, and she had learned a long time ago that the best moments are often the ones you do not fill with everything you are thinking. There were operational changes announced after that. Nora heard most of them and processed the relevant parts and let the rest wash through. She was thinking about something Elliot had said the night before, which she had stored carefully and not examined yet because there had not been a quiet enough moment. "You should have been promoted a year ago." The meeting ended at 11:30. Nora took the stairs back down to the kitchen. Renata was at her station and looked up once and read the outcome from Nora's face with the accuracy of long acquaintance and returned to her work with a small nod that said enough. Patrick Lorne cleared his belongings out by noon. Nora did not watch this happen because she was in the walk-in reorganizing the cold storage to account for a Saturday delivery that had changed that morning, and she found she did not need to watch it happen to know that it had. At 2 in the afternoon, Elliot found her in the walk-in. He stood in the doorway because there was not quite room for 2 people to stand comfortably side by side in a walk-in, while one of them was reorganizing shelving, and he seemed to be the kind of person who understood spatial logistics. She looked up. "The ownership group would like to formalize the sous chef role," he said, "with the appropriate compensation and title adjustment. Starting with the new year." She set down the container she was holding. "And you," she said, "are you the one who recommended it?" "I put it in the review," he said. "It was accurate." "That's not quite an answer." He looked at her from the doorway with that analytical expression she had been cataloging since Monday. Then he said, "Yes, I recommended it." "Thank you," she said. He started to turn, then stopped. "There's also a longer-term operational question," he said. "The Western portfolio is growing. 2 new openings in the next 18 months. The group is looking for someone who understands supply chain management at a regional level." She looked at him steadily. "That sounds like a different conversation." "It is," he said, "and I'd rather have it somewhere that isn't a walk-in refrigerator if that's acceptable." She allowed herself a small amount of amusement. "Saturday," she said, "works for me after 11. He nodded and left the doorway, and Nora stood in the cold room for a moment listening to the hum of the refrigeration unit and the distant sound of the kitchen getting ready for another service. On Saturday she arrived at the coffee shop on Granville Street 11 minutes early, which was her habit, and found Elliot's shoe already there, which was apparently his. He had 2 coffees on the table and the portfolio closed beside him, which meant this was not officially the portfolio part of the conversation. They talked for 2 hours. She had not expected 2 hours. The conversation moved the way conversations move when both people are thinking out loud rather than presenting prepared positions. And Nora, who was very good at identifying the difference, found this easier than she had expected and more interesting than she had planned. He told her about the Victoria restructure, about the decisions that had been necessary and the ones that had been avoidable, and the single one he would undo if he could. She listened the way she listened to things that mattered, which was completely. She told him about the corridor, about standing there with the clipboard and the $50 and the specific quality of Patrick's voice, explaining why she was going to be a problem. He looked at her across the table. He said, "What did you do after you heard it?" She said, "I went back to work." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, what does that mean for you?" "It means I decided I wasn't going to perform differently for the review, and I wasn't going to behave as though I had something to prove, because I didn't. I had something to document." He picked up his coffee. He said, "That's the clearest description of a professional strategy I've heard from someone who didn't call it a strategy." "It wasn't a strategy," she said. "It was just obvious." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile she had already catalogued once in the kitchen and filed away in a different place from her professional notes. On Sunday, she messaged Renata. "Coffee shop went 2 hours. Renata replied in 40 seconds. "I knew since the dry storage." Nora sent back a question mark. Renata sent back the particular kind of silence that in text form means "I'm not going to explain this and I'm right and you know it." Nora put her phone down and looked out the window at a Sunday Vancouver that had finally, genuinely, fully committed to the rain, and she thought about a conversation that had lasted 2 hours and a walk-in doorway, and a description of her own decision-making that she had not called a strategy, and she understood that the next several months were going to be complicated in ways she could not fully map yet, and she found she was not particularly worried. 3 months later, the operational role came through with paperwork, which is how real things arrive. Not with ceremony, but with documents that need to be signed in 2 places. Renata made a small cake with no occasion written on it because she said writing the occasion on the cake was redundant when everyone already knew the occasion. The 2 new restaurant openings were in Victoria and in Calgary. Nora flew to Victoria on a Thursday and Calgary on a Tuesday and stood in empty dining rooms with pencils and clipboards and thought about air circulation and sight lines, and which walls were load-bearing and which ones were just standing there out of habit. Elliot was in Calgary at the same time she was. This had not been planned, which they both acknowledged, and which was not entirely true, because she had mentioned the Calgary dates in a message 3 weeks earlier in a context that was professionally appropriate and personally deliberate. And he had read the message and not mentioned until Calgary that he would also be in Calgary that week, which was its own kind of answer. They had dinner on the Wednesday, not at the restaurant they were each supposed to be assessing. Somewhere without a connection to the group, a small Sichuan place 3 blocks from the hotel that Nora had found because she always looked for the right place for dinner in a new city before she arrived. The same way she always confirmed supplier orders twice and kept original copies of documentation. He told her about his father, who had also worked in hospitality and had also had opinions about the right way to do things. She told him about the first kitchen she had worked in at 22, which had been chaotic in the specific way of a place where no one had ever designed a system, and everyone had simply adapted around the chaos until the chaos became the system. He said, "How do you manage in a system that isn't designed?" She said, "You find the part that is designed and you start there." He looked at her across the table. He said, "I think that might be the most accurate description of how you operate that I've heard." She said, "I've been described less accurately." He said, "By who?" She said, "Patrick Lorne, for one, $50 worth." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I heard about the bet." She looked at him. "When Tuesday of the review week, James told me." She considered this. She said, And I was already not taking it seriously by then," he said. He picked up his glass, "But I was angrier about it than I expected to be." The Sichuan place had good mapo tofu and no particular ambient music. Just the sound of a busy kitchen and the particular warmth of a room where people are eating properly in November. They stayed until the restaurant began to signal through the subtle choreography of table clearing that the evening was done. On the way back, walking the 3 blocks in the kind of cold that Calgary does properly, he said, "There's a board being assembled for a foundation the ownership group wants to set up. Culinary training and kitchen management scholarships. They want someone who understands both sides." She looked at him sideways. "Is this official?" "It will be," he said. "I wanted to tell you before the memo went out." "That's twice now you've told me things before the memo," she said. He said, "I've noticed that you use that time well." She stopped on the sidewalk. He stopped. The street was cold and quiet, and the lights from a restaurant across the road made the wet pavement look like something worth looking at. She said, "What does the board commitment look like?" He said, "Quarterly meetings. Real input on scholarship criteria. Not ceremonial." She said, "And the other thing?" He said, "What other thing?" She looked at him with the expression she used when she had already done the calculation and was waiting for the other person to catch up. He said, "I think that's a conversation for after the memo." She said, "I think it's a conversation for right now, on a street in Calgary, before it gets folded into something official." He looked at her. He said, "I have been trying to find the right moment for 3 months." She said, "Most moments are right if you decide they are." He said nothing for a second. Then he said, "This is the part where you tell me all the reasons it's complicated." She said, "I know all the reasons it's complicated. I wrote them down the week after the review and I've been updating the list since." He said, And none of them are reasons," she said. "They're conditions. I can work with conditions. The Calgary Cold did what Calgary Cold does, which is exist completely and without apology, and neither of them moved for a moment. And then they both moved at the same time in the small way that is neither dramatic nor accidental, and that was that." Renata found out on a Thursday when Nora was back in Vancouver and came into the kitchen with the specific expression Renata had been cataloging since October. Renata said, "Calgary." Nora said, "Calgary." Renata picked up her piping bag. She said, "I knew since the walk-in doorway." Nora said, "No one knows anything since the walk-in doorway. Nothing happened in the walk-in doorway." Renata said, "Nothing happening is still something." The foundation held its first scholarship intake the following spring. 47 applications in the first month. Nora read all of them. She made notes in the margins of the ones that showed something beyond the obvious. The candidates who had figured out workarounds in bad systems, or taught themselves skills that no one had bothered to teach them, or written about failure with the specific honesty that means they understood what failure was for. Elliot was in Vancouver for 3 days during the selection process. On the second evening, they were in the small office off the kitchen, going through the shortlisted files, coffee going cold beside them, the sound of Renata's closing time cleanup coming through the wall. He picked up one application. He said, "This one." She had already flagged it. She showed him her margin note. He read it. He said, "You wrote this on Tuesday." She said, "I read it on Tuesday." He said, "I read it Friday. I had the same note." She looked at him. She said, "We're going to argue about these." He said, "Probably." She said, "Good." He said, "Is that good?" She said, "It means neither of us is performing." She picked up her coffee, which was cold, and drank it anyway, because the point was the coffee, not the temperature. She said, "I spent 3 years in this kitchen being efficient without anyone asking me to lead anything. I am not going to spend the next 3 years agreeing with everything because it's easier." He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the walk-in doorway, which was fully without the portfolio in between. He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He said, "You told Marcus his apology was accepted before he finished giving it. You brought original copies to the Friday meeting. You confirmed the supplier order twice and kept the paper trail." He paused. "You have never once done anything because it was easier." The office was quiet. Outside, Renata had stopped moving around, which either meant she had finished or she was listening, and Nora thought it was probably both. She said, "The scholarship, when it's established." The name. He said, "We were going to call it the Aldrich Foundation." She said, "That's a building name." He thought for a moment. He said, "The Meridian." She said, "After what?" He said, "It's a navigation term, the point from which everything else is measured." She looked at him. She said, "That's not bad." He said, "I know." She said, "I still hate when you have good ideas." He said, "No, you don't." She said, "No, I don't." Outside the window, Vancouver had finally fully committed to spring, which in Vancouver means the rain had changed its quality from gray to luminous, the kind that makes the city look like it was designed to be looked at from the inside through glass. 47 applications on the desk, 2 cold coffees. The kitchen quiet behind them after another service, another night of doing the same things right until right became the only way. Some things take time not because they're difficult, but because they need to arrive properly, in the right season, with the right documentation and the right person standing in a doorway long enough to see what's already there.